Imagine waking up one morning to find that the country you thought was America's most reliable ally in the Middle East had quietly, almost overnight, switched sides, not to Russia, not to China, but to Turkey, a NATO member, an Islamist-leaning government that spent the last decade positioning itself as the new Ottoman power of the modern world. Now imagine that the country making this switch was not some small, unstable nation teetering on the edge of collapse. It was the United Arab Emirates, the gleaming financial capital of the Arab world, the home of Dubai, of Abu Dhabi, of the most ambitious sovereign wealth funds on earth. The country that hosted American troops, signed the Abraham Accords, and positioned itself as the living proof of what a modern Arab state could look like when it chose prosperity over conflict. And imagine that the man engineering this realignment was not even the leader of the UAE. It was Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, quietly constructing the most dramatic geopolitical pivot the Gulf has witnessed in half a century. A pivot that is leaving Abu Dhabi exposed, isolated, and scrambling for a new identity in a world that no longer looks anything like it did 18 months ago. By the time you finish this video, you will understand not just what is happening in the Gulf, but why the tremors radiating outward from Abu Dhabi are the early shockwaves of a restructuring of global power so fundamental, so deep, and so irreversible that everything that comes next for energy markets, for American influence, for the entire architecture of the post-Cold War international system will be shaped by decisions being made right now in the palaces and war rooms of Riyadh, Ankara, and Tehran. Let us start at the very beginning, because to truly understand where the Gulf stands today, you need to understand the world that existed just 18 months ago, and how completely and permanently it has been destroyed by the cascade of events that followed the American decision to strike Iran. To understand the fall of Abu Dhabi, you first need to understand what Abu Dhabi was, what it represented, what it was supposed to become. Because what is being lost is not merely a diplomatic alignment or a military partnership. What is being lost is an idea. A carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, enormously consequential idea about what the Arab world could be and what it could offer to a globalizing world, hungry for stability, opportunity, and alternatives to the chaos that seemed to define so much of the broader Middle East. For 4 decades, the United States built and maintained what it called a security umbrella over the Persian Gulf. This was not charity or idealism. This was the most calculated geopolitical transaction in modern history, a deal structured with the precision of a corporate merger and the ruthlessness of a great power competition. American aircraft carriers rotated through the Arabian Sea on permanent deployment cycles. American military bases dotted the landscape of Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE, providing logistics hubs, pre-positioned equipment, intelligence sharing networks, and the physical presence that communicated American commitment more powerfully than any treaty language ever could. American weapons flowed into Saudi Arabia and the Emirates by the hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades, sustaining the most lucrative arms export relationships in the history of American defense manufacturing and creating deep institutional dependencies that bound Gulf militaries to American supply chains, American spare parts, American technical support, and American congressional approval processes. In exchange for all of this, Gulf oil flowed to global markets priced exclusively in American dollars, cementing the petrodollar system that underpins the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency and gives Washington extraordinary leverage over the global financial system. Gulf sovereign wealth funds recycled their petrodollar earnings into American treasuries, financing American deficits and supporting American asset prices. Gulf states accepted American political leadership on the questions that mattered most to Washington, from how to contain Iran, to how to manage the Palestinian question, to how to structure their internal governance in ways that maintained stability without threatening American commercial interests. It was a transaction in the purest sense of that word. America provided the military guarantee and the political framework. The Gulf provided the petrodollars, the political loyalty, and the strategic geography. And for 4 decades, with periodic turbulence but fundamental continuity, that transaction held together. Then the detonator was lit. American strikes on Iranian territory began the chain reaction. But what exploded in the days and weeks that followed was not merely Iranian infrastructure or Iranian military capability. What exploded was the underlying logic of the American security umbrella itself. Because within the first 72 hours of the American air campaign, Iranian drones and ballistic missiles were already in the air, arcing across the Persian Gulf toward the very nations that had quietly nodded along to American military planning that had allowed their territory to be used as staging grounds, their airspace to be accessed by American aircraft, their intelligence services to coordinate with American counterparts. The nations that had collectively spent hundreds of billions of dollars on American weapon systems, Patriot batteries and THAAD interceptors and F-16 fighter jets and guided missile destroyers, all of it purchased at premium prices, with the explicit understanding that these investments would deter exactly the kind of attack that was now materializing in real time. And in those first terrible hours, the deterrence failed. Or more precisely, the deterrence worked against one kind of threat, a conventional state-on-state military confrontation, while proving inadequate against the kind of distributed, high-volume drone and missile saturation campaign that Iran had spent years and billions of dollars developing specifically to overwhelm American-supplied Gulf air defenses. Dubai International Airport, the single busiest international aviation hub in the world, processing more than 90 million passengers per year and serving as the primary gateway connecting Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, was struck. The evacuation of terminal buildings during active conflict sent images around the world that no amount of official reassurance could fully counteract. The Jebel Ali port, handling more container traffic than any other facility in the Middle East and standing as one of the most critical logistics nodes in global trade, was hit by debris from intercepted Iranian projectiles. The Ruwais industrial complex in Abu Dhabi, housing the largest oil refinery in the country and a facility that normally processes nearly 1 million barrels of petroleum per day, was targeted by Iranian drones, forcing the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company to shut down operations that sent shockwaves through Asian energy markets before sunrise the following morning. An Amazon Web Services data center in Abu Dhabi caught fire after being struck by aerial objects, raising immediate and alarming questions about the survivability of the cloud computing infrastructure that tens of thousands of regional businesses, governments, and financial institutions depend on for their daily operations. This was not collateral damage from a war being fought somewhere far away. This was the war materializing inside the most economically consequential real estate in the entire world, with a precision and a boldness that no one in the Gulf capitals had fully modeled or prepared for. And in that moment, in the hours when the smoke was still rising over Ruwais, and the evacuation sirens were still echoing through Dubai's terminals, and the damage assessment teams were still trying to quantify what had been hit and how badly, something fundamental and irreversible shifted in the private calculations of every Gulf leader sitting in their palaces, watching the reports come in. They had agreed, tacitly or explicitly, to the American military operation against Iran. They had accepted the strategic logic that weakening Iran served their long-term interests. They had bought the weapons, provided the basing, shared the intelligence, allowed American forces to use their territory in ways that any sophisticated adversary would have noted and targeted accordingly. And now they were absorbing the consequences directly, with their airports hit and their oil refineries shut down and their populations frightened in ways that no official statement could entirely contain. And the question forming in the back of every Gulf ruler's mind, in whatever private chambers they retreated to when the cameras were switched off, was devastatingly simple. If this is what it costs to be on America's side, what exactly is America offering that makes this cost acceptable? What is the value proposition of a military guarantee that invites the attack it was supposed to prevent? That question did not have a comfortable answer. And the man who grasped this most clearly and moved fastest and most decisively to act on it was Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Now the story becomes genuinely complex because MBS and the UAE leadership, principally Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, have maintained a relationship of both partnership and rivalry that stretches back through decades of Gulf politics. They are brothers in the Gulf family, united by geography and culture and a shared ancestral fear of Iranian power and a shared interest in maintaining the stability of monarchical governance against any force, democratic, Islamist, or revolutionary, that might threaten it. But they are also competitors for regional influence, for international prestige, for the investment flows of the global capital markets that both kingdoms need to fund their ambitious domestic transformation programs. Two men with two enormous pools of sovereign wealth and two meaningfully different visions of what the Arab world should become in the 21st century. And in this crisis, those differences have begun pulling them in directions that are increasingly divergent and, for the UAE in particular, increasingly dangerous and increasingly difficult to navigate. What MBS is doing right now, beneath the surface of the publicly visible crisis management, is something that almost no analyst in the Western mainstream press is covering with the seriousness and depth it deserves. While the UAE is absorbing Iranian strikes and scrambling to fully activate its American-supplied Patriot and THAAD missile defense batteries, and trying to manage the economic fallout of disruptions to its airport and port and refinery operations, Saudi Arabia under MBS has been conducting a parallel diplomatic and defense industrial campaign, quiet and purposeful and accelerating rapidly, with Ankara, with Turkey, with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The same Erdogan that MBS was publicly feuding with just 3 years ago over Qatar, over the Muslim Brotherhood, over the Khashoggi affair, over competing visions of regional influence. The same Turkey that the UAE viewed as an existential ideological competitor for the soul of Arab governance. The data on what has been happening between Riyadh and Ankara is now too substantial and too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or routine procurement. Over just 10 days at the World Defense Show in Riyadh in early 2026, Turkey and Saudi Arabia signed a comprehensive series of high-level defense industrial agreements covering a fifth-generation fighter jet development program, a utility helicopter platform, and a range of unmanned naval surface and subsurface vehicles. The total package of deals was valued at approximately $8.8 billion, making it one of the largest bilateral defense agreements ever signed outside of traditional American or European arms sales frameworks. Saudi Arabia's Military Industries Corporation, the domestic defense company that MBS has been building into a genuine industrial champion as part of Vision 2030, signed technology transfer agreements with 3 separate Turkish defense firms, agreements that are explicitly designed to build Saudi domestic manufacturing capability rather than merely purchasing finished weapon systems. Saudi technical personnel, numbering in the hundreds, have already been sent to Baykar, the Turkish company that manufactures the Bayraktar series of combat drones that proved their battlefield effectiveness so dramatically in Libya, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine, for embedded technical training that will allow Saudi engineers to eventually manufacture and maintain these systems independently. And the Turkish aerospace company displayed its next-generation Khan stealth fighter at the Riyadh show with a Saudi flag painted on its tail fin, a deliberate, unmistakable, and very public signal that Riyadh is seriously considering becoming the launch customer and co-production partner for a fifth-generation aircraft built entirely outside American oversight, American export control regulations, and American congressional approval processes. This is not routine procurement. This is not one country buying weapons from another because the price point happened to be competitive in a particular budget cycle. What is being built between Riyadh and Ankara is a defense industrial partnership whose strategic implications extend far beyond any individual weapon system or any individual transaction. The critical thing that Turkey offers Saudi Arabia, the thing that Washington simply cannot match regardless of how sophisticated its weapons technology becomes, is defense relationships without political conditions, no congressional delays, no human rights riders attached to every export license, no threat that a future American administration might cut off spare parts or withhold technical support certifications if Riyadh does something that Washington disapproves of, whether that something is a military intervention in Yemen, a domestic political crackdown, a diplomatic initiative that undermines American policy in the region, or a decision to price some fraction of Saudi oil in currencies other than the dollar. That conditionality, that permanent American leverage over Gulf military capability, is not a theoretical concern or a remote possibility. It is a recurring, practical constraint that MBS has bumped against repeatedly, and that has shaped his strategic thinking in ways that are now producing visible and consequential decisions. The lesson that hardened MBS's thinking was delivered not once, but twice in quick succession. In 2019, Iranian drone and cruise missile attacks devastated the Abqaiq oil processing facility, the single most important piece of energy infrastructure in the world, responsible for processing roughly 7% of global oil supply. The attack was extraordinarily brazen, extraordinarily precise, and extraordinarily effective. The American response was extraordinarily limited. Washington issued public condemnations, moved a modest additional troop deployment to Saudi Arabia as a show of symbolic solidarity, and then essentially moved on to other priorities. No retaliatory strikes, no escalatory pressure, no meaningful shift in the military posture that might have deterred future attacks. MBS filed that lesson away. Then in 2025, Israeli attacks on Gulf targets, including the strike on Doha that shocked every Gulf capital simultaneously and demonstrated that even the most fundamental assumptions about American protection of its partners could not be relied upon, reinforced the lesson with brutal clarity. When it matters most, when the bombs are actually falling and the refineries are burning and the leadership is sheltering in hardened facilities, America weighs its strategic interests, its domestic politics, its relationship with Israel, and the Gulf states absorb whatever consequences flow from that calculation. He decided, with the cold clarity of a leader who has been burned twice by the same fire, that Saudi Arabia needed security partners whose interests were more directly and durably aligned with Riyadh's own survival. The architecture he is building reflects the full scope of that decision. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan formalized a mutual defense pact in September 2025, a bilateral security commitment modeled explicitly on NATO's Article 5 collective defense language, stipulating that an attack on one party is to be treated as an attack on both. Then Turkey sought to join that framework, viewing the trilateral arrangement as a vehicle for strengthening regional deterrence at precisely the moment when American reliability was being most publicly and most painfully questioned. The strategic logic of the trilateral combination, as analysts in Ankara, Islamabad, and Riyadh have articulated it openly, is elegantly complementary. Saudi Arabia brings the financial resources and the energy leverage to sustain a long-term independent security architecture. Pakistan brings nuclear capability, ballistic missiles, a large standing army with genuine combat experience, and the demographic weight of a nation of 230 million people. Turkey brings NATO standard military training and doctrine, a defense industrial base that has demonstrated the ability to produce globally competitive weapon systems, battlefield-tested operational experience from Syria to Libya to Azerbaijan, and the unique strategic position of a country that sits astride the intersection of Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, with a foot in both the NATO world and the emerging multipolar order. These three sets of capabilities fit together in a way that creates something genuinely more than the sum of its parts. They create the nucleus of an independent regional security architecture that does not require American approval to function, does not depend on American weapons to arm itself, and does not need American diplomatic protection to operate. Now, let us talk about money and energy, because this is where the consequences of everything we have discussed stop being a regional story and become a global one, affecting every person on Earth who pays for gasoline, who depends on affordable goods crossing oceans, who has retirement savings in equity markets, or who relies on a functioning global financial system to service the debt that their government or their corporation or their household carries. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. Through those 21 miles flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply every single day. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, 20% of all petroleum consumed by every economy on Earth. Roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil, refined petroleum products, and liquefied natural gas pass through that waterway every 24 hours, connecting the production fields of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran itself to the import markets of Asia, Europe, and the wider world. Japan imports nearly 90% of its oil through Hormuz. South Korea imports the overwhelming majority of its energy supplies through the same route. India, the world's third largest oil consumer and one of the fastest growing major economies, depends on Hormuz for a large share of its petroleum imports. China, the world's largest oil importer by volume, moves billions of dollars of energy purchases through the strait every month. The European nations scrambling to replace Russian gas supplies they lost after the Ukraine war have been expanding their purchases of Gulf liquefied natural gas, much of which also passes through Hormuz en route to European terminals. There is no exaggerating the centrality of this single geographical choke point to the functioning of the global economy. If Hormuz closes, even partially, even temporarily, the global energy system does not merely experience disruption. It experiences something that more closely resembles cardiac arrest. Iran's new supreme leader has declared explicitly and publicly that the Hormuz closure will be maintained and deployed as a strategic instrument of pressure against enemies. Oil prices have already begun reflecting the market's assessment of this threat. The International Energy Agency has warned that global oil supply could fall by as much as 8 million barrels per day if shipping through the strait drops to a fraction of its normal volumes. To put that number in its proper historical context, the entire oil production of Russia, the second largest oil exporting nation in the world, is approximately 10 million barrels per day. A Hormuz-induced supply shortfall of 8 million barrels would be roughly equivalent to removing nearly all of Russia from the global oil market simultaneously, with no warning period and no alternative supply source ready and capable of filling the void. The IEA triggered the largest release of emergency petroleum reserves from its member nations' strategic stockpiles in the organization's entire history, a move that buys days and weeks of buffer time, but cannot substitute for the raw volume of oil that normally flows through the strait day after day after day. Iran's warning that oil could reach $200 per barrel in a sustained Hormuz closure scenario is not political theater or propaganda designed purely for domestic consumption. It is a straightforward statement of the mathematics of global energy supply and demand under conditions of severe disruption. And at $200 per barrel, the economic consequences radiate through the global system with a force that is almost impossible to fully model, but whose broad outlines are deeply alarming to anyone who understands the interconnected fragility of modern economic systems. Airlines, which already operate on profit margins so thin that a $50 swing in oil prices can mean the difference between profitability and bankruptcy, and which are simultaneously major employers and essential infrastructure for global commerce and tourism, face a simultaneous existential squeeze. Global shipping costs, which are already embedded invisibly in the price of literally every manufactured good that crosses an ocean, from the smartphone in your pocket to the clothing on your body to the food in your kitchen, double and then double again, as vessel operators scramble to find alternative routing through the Cape of Good Hope at costs and time delays that fundamentally alter the economics of global trade. Agricultural production worldwide which depends on petroleum-based fertilizers and petroleum-fueled machinery for virtually every aspect of the modern farming cycle, faces cost increases that translate directly and rapidly into food price inflation in markets as far away as West Africa and South Asia, where food costs already consume the largest share of household budgets for hundreds of millions of people. Manufacturing costs in every industrial economy on Earth spike simultaneously, compressing corporate profit margins, triggering hiring freezes and investment postponements and supply chain restructurings that feed back into consumer confidence, consumer spending, corporate tax revenues, and the fiscal positions of governments that are already carrying debt loads accumulated over years of deficit spending. And then there are the financial markets, which are pricing in the war risk, but have not yet fully absorbed a $200 oil scenario. Equity markets globally have already entered a period of elevated volatility as investors try to model outcomes for which there is no clean historical precedent. When central banks face a simultaneous, severe, sustained supply-side inflation shock of this magnitude, they are confronted with a policy choice that has no good option and no middle path. They can raise interest rates aggressively to fight the inflation, which in a global economy carrying the accumulated debt loads of the post-pandemic era would trigger a cascade of mortgage defaults, corporate bond failures, sovereign debt distress events, and a recession that makes previous downturns look manageable. Or they can hold rates low or cut them to support economic activity, accepting inflationary conditions that would devastate the purchasing power of working and middle-class populations in every affected country, producing the kind of political instability and social anger that rewrites electoral outcomes, empowers extremist movements, and destabilizes the democratic institutions that Western governments have spent decades and trillions of dollars trying to build and maintain. There is no monetary policy lever that simultaneously defeats supply-side inflation and sustains economic growth when the underlying cause of the inflation is the physical absence of a critical raw material from global markets. The choice is between two different versions of economic pain, and the political consequences of both are severe enough to genuinely alarm policymakers in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and Beijing. The Gulf states understand all of this with an intimacy that no outsider analyst can fully match, because they live at the center of the global energy system and have studied its architecture, its vulnerabilities, and its dependencies with more focused sophistication than almost any government on Earth. But what is crucial to understand, and what sits at the very heart of why MBS is building the Turkish alliance, and why the strategic logic of that alliance is so compelling from Riyadh's perspective, is that Saudi Arabia is not merely a victim of the Hormuz crisis. It is, in a very specific and strategically decisive sense, the country best positioned to manage it, profit from it, and convert it into lasting geopolitical leverage. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, connecting the Gulf Coast oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, has a throughput capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day. It is the only meaningful bypass route for Gulf oil that does not require navigating the Strait of Hormuz, and it sits entirely within Saudi territory, under Saudi sovereign control, insulated from Iranian pressure and from the maritime disruption that is devastating shipping routes through the Gulf itself. It cannot fully replace Hormuz. The mathematics of global oil consumption do not allow for that, but it can meaningfully mitigate the catastrophe, enough to give whoever controls it extraordinary leverage over every major petroleum importing economy in the world. Japan, South Korea, India, China, and the European nations, scrambling for emergency supplies, all need Saudi cooperation with the East-West pipeline, routing to avoid the full severity of an economic disaster that their political systems genuinely cannot absorb. And Saudi Arabia is sitting at the valve. This is the foundation on which MBS is constructing his most ambitious geopolitical gambit. He is not merely reacting to Iranian aggression or managing the consequences of American unreliability. He is actively using the chaos and the disruption of this war to execute the most consequential repositioning of Saudi Arabia's global strategic role in the kingdom's modern history. He is converting Saudi Arabia from a dependent client of American security into the indispensable swing actor of the most severe global energy crisis in generations, the nation that holds the keys to whether the world's most critical supply disruption becomes manageable or catastrophic. The Turkish military alliance is the instrument through which he acquires the defense industrial independence that makes this repositioning sustainable and durable over the long term. A Saudi Arabia that depends on American weapons and American spare parts and American congressional goodwill for its military operational capability cannot truly leverage its energy position against American interests when those interests conflict with Saudi priorities, because Washington can always threaten to turn off the military supply relationship as a counterpressure. But a Saudi Arabia that is co-producing fifth-generation fighters with Turkey, domestically manufacturing armed drones through technology transfer partnerships with Baykar, and sheltered within a mutual defense architecture with Pakistan and Turkey modeled on NATO collective security principles, that Saudi Arabia has genuine strategic autonomy for perhaps the first time in its modern history. It can negotiate with Washington from a position of genuine independence rather than dependency. And independence is what converts regional power into global leverage. Now let us return to the UAE, because understanding the specific trap that Abu Dhabi finds itself in is essential to understanding why the title of this video names the fall of Abu Dhabi specifically, and not the wider collapse of the Gulf order more generally. Saudi Arabia, for all the danger and turbulence of this crisis, is actually gaining strategic leverage within it. MBS is playing what should be a weak hand with the instinctive aggression, opportunism, and long-term strategic vision that characterize his leadership at its most effective. He is not trying to preserve the old order. He is building power within the new one that is replacing it. The UAE is doing something fundamentally different: the Dubai model, the Abu Dhabi financial hub, the cosmopolitan economy built on tourism, technology, finance, and logistics, the Abraham Accords architecture with its Israeli intelligence partnerships and Israeli business and technology relationships, the American military partnership with its basing agreements and its Patriot batteries and its implicit guarantee, the image of security and stability that is not merely a public relations asset, but the foundational precondition for the confidence of the global capital and the global talent that flows through the Emirates every single day. The UAE is trying to hold on to an existing order at the precise historical moment when that order is being systematically demolished around it by forces too large and too powerful for any single small country to resist. And the painful irony that must keep Emirati strategists awake in the deep hours of the night is that the very relationships that made the UAE so extraordinary, the American security umbrella, the Israeli normalization, the pro-Western positioning, the cosmopolitan openness, are now making it the most exposed, most targeted, most geopolitically vulnerable country in the Gulf. Iran is not randomly selecting its strike coordinates from some indifferent list of military targets. It is systematically and deliberately attacking the most visible, most consequential symbols of the American-aligned, Israel-normalized Arab modernity that the UAE embodies more completely and more visibly than any other nation in the region. The Abraham Accords, which the UAE celebrated as a strategic masterstroke when they were signed, as a deal that simultaneously gave Abu Dhabi access to Israeli technology and intelligence, opened commercial pathways to Israeli business ecosystems, signaled cosmopolitan modernity to global investors, and positioned the Emirates at the center of a new American-brokered regional architecture, now sit at the center of the UAE's strategic dilemma. Because the Accords have made the UAE a primary target in Iran's campaign to demonstrate that alignment with Israel carries an unacceptable cost. Every Israeli business that opened a Dubai office, every Israeli intelligence contractor that established regional operations in Abu Dhabi, every American military asset that flows through UAE territory is a point of Iranian targeting justification. And Saudi Arabia, which was supposed to be next in line to join the Accords, and whose participation would have converted the framework from a promising bilateral arrangement into a genuine regional realignment, has now made clear through its actions and its diplomatic signaling that normalization with Israel under current conditions is not merely politically difficult. It is finished. The Saudi-Israeli deal that was supposed to be the capstone of the Abraham Accords architecture, the crowning achievement of American Middle Eastern diplomacy, was never delivered before the war began. And in the environment the war has created, with Arab public opinion inflamed by the devastation in Gaza and Iranian missiles visibly striking Gulf infrastructure, it cannot now be delivered on any timeline that current political conditions allow for. For the UAE, the loss of the Saudi normalization prospect is not merely a diplomatic disappointment, it is a fundamental strategic blow because the value of the Emirati investment in the Abraham Accords was predicated substantially on Saudi Arabia eventually joining and transforming the framework from a bilateral curiosity into a regional architecture that permanently restructured Middle Eastern power dynamics. Without Saudi Arabia, the Accords remain, but their strategic significance is diminished in ways that are difficult to compensate for. The UAE holds a position in an alliance framework that is no longer capable of delivering the regional transformation it was designed to produce, and it holds that position while bearing the cost of being Iran's most economically valuable target. Here is what makes the UAE's position genuinely existential rather than merely diplomatically uncomfortable. Dubai is not merely a city or a national capital or a commercial center. It is a system of confidence, a carefully constructed and meticulously maintained signal to global capital and global talent that the Middle East contains one place that operates by global rules, that honors contracts and property rights and judicial independence, that provides world-class infrastructure and connectivity, that is safe and stable enough to build long-term businesses in, to base regional headquarters in, to raise families in, to store and invest significant wealth in. Every element of that signal depends on the perception of security. It is not the reality of security that matters in the first instance, though that matters too. It is the perception. The confidence that tomorrow will be as stable as today, and that the rules by which business operates will not change catastrophically overnight. And every time an Iranian drone is intercepted in the airspace above Dubai, every time emergency evacuations are ordered from terminals at the world's busiest international airport, every time debris from intercepted missiles falls in the vicinity of the port facilities or the financial district or the residential towers where the expatriate professionals who keep Dubai's economy running actually live, that perception takes a measurable, quantifiable, and in the long run, irreversible hit. The economic architecture that this perception of security has supported is staggering in its scale and its complexity. The Jebel Ali Free Zone alone hosts more than 9,000 companies from over 100 countries, making it one of the most concentrated clusters of international commercial activity anywhere in the world. The Dubai International Financial Center operates under its own English common law jurisdiction with its own independent courts, and it serves as the primary legal, regulatory, and financial gateway for Western companies operating across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, a combined catchment area encompassing more than 2 billion people in economic activity measured in the tens of trillions of dollars annually. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority manages an estimated $800 billion in global assets, positioning it among the 4 largest sovereign wealth funds in the world and making it a significant investor in equity markets, real estate, infrastructure, and private equity across every major economy on Earth. These are not abstract numbers. They are the physical embodiment of what 50 years of visionary, disciplined, and sometimes ruthless national economic strategy has built. And they are all, every single dimension of them, premised on an assumption of security stability that the war has now rendered uncertain in ways that the UAE government cannot fully reassure its way out of. The multinational CFOs and regional directors and treasury managers at global corporations who headquartered their Middle East operations in Dubai over the past 2 decades are not panicking. Panic is premature and panic is expensive, and experienced operators do not panic in response to elevated risk that has not yet fully materialized into actual business disruption. But they are having conversations that they were not having 18 months ago. Conversations about business continuity planning across multiple locations. Conversations about distributed risk, and whether concentrating so much regional operational infrastructure in a single location that is now demonstrably within the strike range of Iranian weapon systems represents an acceptable risk exposure for corporate boards and insurance underwriters and the institutional investors who scrutinize such decisions. Those conversations, even when they do not immediately produce relocation announcements or dramatic structural changes, alter the calculus around new investment commitments, around long-term lease decisions, around hiring plans, around which city gets proposed as the venue for the next regional conference or the next high-net-worth client summit. And 1,000 cautious recalibrations, each individually modest and individually justifiable, accumulate over months and years into a structural shift that is ultimately just as damaging to Dubai's model as any single catastrophic event would be. The final piece of this analysis, the piece that determines whether what we are witnessing is a temporary disruption from which the UAE can recover or a permanent historical turning point after which recovery to the previous equilibrium becomes impossible, is the question of American strategic credibility in the broader region. Because beneath every specific development we have examined, beneath the Turkish drone deals and the Saudi-Pakistani Defense Pact and the Hormuz closure and the collapse of the Abraham Accords expansion and the targeting of UAE infrastructure, there is a single underlying reality that is driving all of it and that makes all of it, individually and collectively, comprehensible. The American era of Middle Eastern strategic primacy is ending, not because American military capability has diminished in any absolute technical sense. American carrier strike groups remain the most powerful concentrations of naval air power ever assembled by any nation in history. American air superiority technology remains unmatched by any competitor, but military dominance, as the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated with painful clarity over 20 years, and as the current Gulf situation is demonstrating again with equal clarity, does not automatically and reliably translate into political control or sustained strategic stability. America can bomb Iran. It demonstrated that. It can destroy Iranian military infrastructure and Iranian nuclear program facilities. What American military power cannot do is bomb its way to a stable Gulf. It cannot bomb Iran into stopping drone attacks on the airports and refineries of American allies. It cannot bomb the Arab streets' rage about Gaza into indifference. It cannot bomb away the memory of the times American presidents weighed their domestic political calculations and their relationships with Israel, and decided that Gulf Arab states would have to absorb whatever consequences followed. And it cannot bomb away the fundamental conclusion that has now settled with the weight of lived experience behind it in the minds of Gulf leaders. That being America's ally in a war against Iran is not security. It is an invitation. It is a marker painted on your infrastructure that tells Iran where to aim. MBS understands this with a cold and unsentimental clarity. He understands it because he has been given no choice but to understand it. The road from the Abqaiq attack in 2019 to the strikes on Doha in 2025 to the current devastation in the Gulf has been a systematic education in the limits of American protection, delivered through concrete physical consequences rather than theoretical diplomatic analysis. And the Turkish military alliance is the most publicly visible expression of the strategic conclusion he has drawn from that education. He is building Saudi Arabia for the world that actually exists, not for the world that was supposed to exist according to the assumptions of the post-Cold War American-led order that has now definitively passed its peak. For the UAE, a similar reinvention is urgently necessary, but the constraints are more severe, the options are more limited, and the timeline for finding workable answers is shorter than any of the Emirati leadership's planning assumptions would have anticipated. Abu Dhabi must find a way to reduce its profile as an Iranian target without abandoning the Israeli and American relationships that define its strategic identity and sustain the economic model that makes the UAE valuable and functional. It must find a way to remain relevant and protected within the emerging Saudi-Turkish framework without endorsing an ideological vision of political Islam and Erdogan-style governance that conflicts fundamentally with its foundational political philosophy. It must find a way to maintain global capital's confidence in Dubai as a safe and stable operational base, while the security environment that confidence depends on is being reconstructed in real time by forces the UAE cannot control and can barely influence. These are genuinely difficult tasks. The Emirates has accomplished difficult things before, things that the experts said could not be done, building a global financial hub in a desert, normalizing with Israel without domestic instability, maintaining geopolitical neutrality in a region defined by conflict. But the margin for error in the current environment is narrower than it has ever been. The forces reshaping the landscape are larger and more powerful than anything the UAE has previously confronted, and the time available for finding answers that work is being compressed by every week of continued conflict. The signal flares burning over Abu Dhabi right now are illuminating something far larger than a single city's strategic dilemma or a single country's diplomatic challenge. They are revealing the outline of the world that comes after American Middle Eastern primacy. A world organized not around a single dominant external power's security guarantees and political preferences, but around multiple overlapping, competing, and sometimes cooperating regional partnerships, each seeking the strategic autonomy that comes from genuine options and genuine alternatives. Turkey built that autonomy through decades of careful fence-sitting and institutional development and domestic defense industrialization. Pakistan built it through its nuclear program and its cultivation of relationships on multiple sides of every major regional divide. Saudi Arabia under MBS is building it now through the Turkish Defense Partnership, the Pakistani Mutual Defense Pact, the energy leverage that comes from controlling the only meaningful alternative to Hormuz, and the financial resources that come from being the world's largest proven oil reserve holder at a moment when the world's oil supply is under its most severe strain in half a century. The UAE bet everything on a different model, on the model that said alignment with America, normalization with Israel, integration with Western financial markets, and the projection of cosmopolitan modernity were the most reliable routes to permanent security and permanent prosperity in the modern world. That bet made enormous sense in the world that existed when it was made. In the world that exists now, with Iranian missiles landing on Emirati infrastructure and American security guarantees proving insufficient, and Saudi Arabia pivoting toward a new security architecture that the UAE cannot fully join without abandoning core aspects of its identity, that bet is being stress-tested by the hardest possible conditions. The outcome of that stress test, whether the UAE model proves resilient enough to survive and adapt, or whether it proves to have been inseparably dependent on a geopolitical order that can no longer be sustained, will be one of the defining stories of the next decade. And its implications for global energy markets, for international finance, for the future of American strategic influence, and for every government watching these events and drawing lessons about the reliability of American security guarantees and the risks of American-aligned foreign policy extend far beyond the Gulf and far beyond the immediate crisis. Watch carefully. Because what is being decided in the palaces and the port facilities and the defense deal rooms of the Gulf right now will shape the architecture of the global order for a generation. But to understand the full gravity of what is unfolding, we need to spend more time inside the economic mathematics of the Hormuz crisis, because the numbers tell a story that is more alarming than any political analysis can fully capture on its own. Consider what $200 oil actually means at the level of household economics across the developed world. American consumers, who already felt the political consequences of elevated gasoline prices during the post-pandemic inflation period, would face pump prices that make those previous highs look moderate by comparison. European households, which depend on heating oil and gas for warmth through the winter months, and which are already paying elevated energy costs following the restructuring of European energy supply after the Russia-Ukraine war, would face an energy cost burden that consumes a dramatically higher share of disposable income, leaving less for everything else that drives consumer demand and economic growth. And in the developing world, in South Asia and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where energy subsidies have already stretched government budgets to their limits, and where the populations most affected by inflation are also the most politically volatile, the social consequences of a sustained oil price spike of this magnitude are genuinely difficult to predict and potentially very dangerous to existing political arrangements. The shipping economics alone deserve close examination because global trade in the current era is built on an assumption of affordable maritime transport that a Hormuz closure challenges at its foundation. The container shipping industry, which moves roughly 90% of the world's manufactured goods, was already structurally disrupted by the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping that followed the Gaza conflict. Those attacks forced shipping companies to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding days and thousands of miles to each voyage and dramatically increasing fuel costs, charter rates, and insurance premiums for every cargo crossing between Asia and Europe. A full Hormuz closure on top of that existing Red Sea disruption would mean that 2 of the world's 3 most critical maritime corridors were simultaneously compromised, forcing an already stretched global shipping network into routing configurations that the current vessel fleet and the current port infrastructure were never designed to handle at the required volumes. The insurance industry is telling a story that quantifies the market's fear in ways that are impossible to dismiss as political exaggeration. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf have reached levels not seen since the Iran-Iraq tanker war of the 1980s. Some insurers have simply withdrawn coverage for Gulf transits entirely, leaving shipping companies either to self-insure at enormous financial risk or to refuse the routes altogether. When insurance markets price in this level of risk, actual physical trade flows are affected immediately and materially, because no responsible logistics manager books a cargo movement that cannot be adequately insured regardless of how important that cargo might be to the receiving economy. And now we need to talk about what all of this means specifically for the Abraham Accords and for the Israeli dimension of the UAE's strategic predicament. Because the intersection between the economic crisis, the security crisis, and the normalization architecture is where the UAE's dilemma becomes most acute and most difficult to resolve. The Abraham Accords gave the UAE 3 things that were each extraordinarily valuable in different ways. First, they gave Abu Dhabi access to Israeli defense technology, particularly in cybersecurity, surveillance, and intelligence analysis, areas where Israeli firms like NSO Group and others had developed capabilities that were genuinely world-leading and that the UAE needed for both domestic security purposes and for maintaining the competitive intelligence picture of a country operating in a complex regional environment. Second, the Accords unlocked commercial and investment flows between Israeli technology companies and Emirati sovereign wealth funds and investment vehicles, giving Abu Dhabi preferential access to Israeli innovation ecosystems at a time when Israeli technology startups were producing some of the most globally competitive companies in artificial intelligence, agricultural technology, water management, and cybersecurity. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the long-term strategic picture, the Accords positioned the UAE as an indispensable broker between the Israeli and Arab worlds, a country that could talk to both sides, host meetings between parties that could not formally meet elsewhere, facilitate business and intelligence cooperation that operated beneath the level of official diplomatic recognition, and claim a unique and valuable convening role in the emerging new Middle East architecture. All 3 of those benefits are now under threat simultaneously for reasons that are directly connected to the war and to Iran's systematic targeting of the UAE as the most visible embodiment of the normalization framework. The cybersecurity and intelligence sharing relationship with Israel is a direct Iranian targeting justification. The technology investment flows are being disrupted by the security environment and by the reluctance of Israeli entrepreneurs and executives to maintain routine business travel to a city that is now absorbing Iranian strikes. And the convening role, the ability to serve as the neutral ground for diplomatic and commercial interactions that could not happen elsewhere, depends entirely on Abu Dhabi being perceived as genuinely neutral and genuinely safe, conditions that are both now in question in ways they were not before the war began. The UAE government's public posture through all of this has been carefully calibrated in ways that reveal just how difficult the navigation has become. Emirati officials have described their country as being in a state of defense, a formulation that is precise and deliberate. It is not the language of an ally fully committed to the American and Israeli war effort. It does not call for escalation. It does not demand that the United States expand its military operations on the UAE's behalf. It is the language of a country trying to maintain enough ambiguity to keep communication channels open with Iran, even while absorbing Iranian attacks, trying trying to signal to Washington that Emirati patience has limits without triggering the kind of rupture in the American relationship that would leave the UAE without any security architecture at all, and trying to maintain enough domestic calm that the Dubai confidence signal does not break down entirely before a new strategic equilibrium can be found. This is extraordinarily difficult diplomacy, being conducted under conditions of physical attack and economic disruption by a leadership that has never previously had to manage a crisis of this magnitude and this complexity. The UAE under MBS built its diplomatic reputation on careful positioning, on using financial resources and strategic patience to navigate difficult situations without being forced into binary choices. But the current situation is generating binary pressures that financial resources and diplomatic patience cannot entirely dissolve. At some point, the UAE will need to make choices about how deep its commitment to the Abraham Accords framework genuinely runs when that framework carries real and escalating costs, but whether its relationship with Saudi Arabia takes precedence over its ideological opposition to the Turkish Islamist model that MBS is now embracing as a security partner, about whether the American security guarantee is worth the exposure it creates, or whether some version of a more independent, more genuinely neutral Emirati positioning offers a more sustainable path to the security and stability that the Dubai model requires. Those are not comfortable choices. They do not have clean answers. And the window within which they can be deliberated and resolved carefully without being forced by events into premature and potentially irreversible decisions is narrower every day. This is the substance of the fall of Abu Dhabi. Not fires and evacuations, though those are real and their economic consequences are severe. The fall of Abu Dhabi is the collapse of the strategic concept that Abu Dhabi represented. The idea that an Arab state could fully normalize with Israel, comprehensively align with America, open itself without reservation to global capital and global culture and global governance standards, and do all of this within the framework of a genuinely stable, genuinely secure, genuinely sustainable national project. That idea is now being subjected to the most demanding real-world test it has ever faced. And the outcome of that test will determine not just the future of the UAE, but the future of every argument in every capital in the developing world. That alignment with the American-led international order is a reliable path to security and prosperity rather than a source of exposure and vulnerability. The world is watching Abu Dhabi right now. And the lesson it draws from what it sees will shape the next chapter of global geopolitics in ways that will outlast this war, outlast this crisis, outlast even the specific leaders and the specific decisions that brought us to this moment. That is the true stakes of the fall of Abu Dhabi. And that is why whatever happens next in the Gulf, whatever settlement or escalation or prolonged stalemate follows the battles being fought today, this moment will be remembered as the moment when the American-led Middle Eastern order definitively ended, and the uncertain, more dangerous, more multipolar world that replaces it definitively began. Stay analytical. And never stop watching, because in the burning skies above the Gulf, in the decisions being made in real time by men who understand this moment is the hinge of history. The future of the entire global order is being written.